He wasn't just aggressive, he was feared. Feared like a storm that had already destroyed too much. At the shelter they whispered his name, Huckleby like a warning. He had torn through cages, growled at every hand that reached out in his eyes. They didn't shine with anger, they shimmered with something far worse: loss. No one knew where he came from, only that he'd come out of a fire still burning from the inside. Until one day, a small girl named Eloan sat by his kennel, didn't speak, didn't flinch. She just drew him, a heart above his head. And when the staff came in the next morning, the drawing was still there. And so was he. Change still waiting. They thought he was the one being saved, but maybe he was the one sent to save her. The fire had torn through the southern ridge of Winslow Hill, leaving behind a blackened skeleton of pine and smoke. Winds swept down from the Cascade Mountains, cold and metallic, carrying the scent of damp earth char and something else, something alive. It was early November, and the town had barely begun recovering when the call came in. A dog had been found at the edge of the burn zone. The search crew thought it was a shadow, at first just a shape moving against the smoldering earth. But as they drew closer, they saw it was no ghost, no figment from the smoke. It was a golden retriever, large and limping, its coat once golden, but now streaked with ash and soot. It stood still, its body trembling but upright like a monument that refused to fall. The dog weighed close to 80 pounds. Its fur was gray gold, singed and tangled. Around its neck a half-melted chain hung loose, the metal blackened and warped. Beneath the chain, pink skin peeked out, burned raw. And yet, what struck the rescue team most weren't the wounds. It was the dog's eyes, fierce, sharp, not wild but defiant. When they tried to leash him, he growled not with panic, but with precision, controlled warning. It took a sedative to bring him in. At the Evergreen Rescue Center, nestled near the northern tree line of Winslow Hill, the dog was rolled in on a stretcher and placed in a temporary holding kennel. There were whispers among the staff, already. Most animals came in, shaking subdued. This one came in glaring. They named him Huckleby. No one remembered who suggested it, but the name stuck raw, rough-edged, fitting for a creature carved out of smoke and flame. On the first night, Huckleby chewed through the bars of his kennel, bent them outward like old wire. It took them half an hour to corner and sedate him again. By the second night, he'd destroyed the reinforced cage they moved him into, left deep scratch marks on the wall, tore through 2 wool blankets, and cracked the stainless steel bowl clean in half. By the morning of the third day, no one wanted kennel duty in his wing. It was Corinne Latchley, a young handler with short blonde hair and a stitched-up jacket, who got too close. She was placing a food tray through the slot when Huckleby lunged. He didn't bite his teeth, snapped just inches from her arm, but the force of it knocked the tray clean across the room, and her elbow struck the wall on the way back. A bruise, a warning. They wrote it up as a level 4 red response. After that, a printed sign went up on the kennel gate: "Do not approach. Extreme aggression." Huckleby didn't bark. He didn't whine. But at night, when the shelter lights dimmed and the halls fell quiet, the growl came. Low, unrelenting, like a wound that refused to close. It was still early when the morning fog drifted down from the ridge and rolled low over Winslow Hill, wrapping the trees and rooftops in pale silver. The air smelled of cedar and cold iron. Inside the Evergreen Rescue Center, the hallways hummed with the clink of food bowls and the distant barks of restless dogs. Most mornings followed a rhythm: here feed clean, calm. But ever since Huckleby arrived, that rhythm had changed. The entire back wing now moved around his presence. In the far corner of the intake corridor, the heavy steel-gated kennel where Huckleby was confined remained still. No chewing sounds, no claws scraping metal, just the occasional deep exhale from the massive dog that lay curled against the wall, eyes barely open, watching. At 8:02 a.m., the front bell chimed. Dr. Delia Briggs pushed open the front door of the rescue center with her hip, a worn leather tote over one shoulder and a steaming travel mug in the other. Her red flannel coat was buttoned only halfway, revealing a faded Evergreen Rescue t-shirt beneath. She was lean, always tired-looking, with smile lines that hadn't seen much use lately. The kind of woman who measured affection, not by words, but by action, cleaned wounds, made charts, remembered birthdays. Trailing behind her was her daughter, Eloan Briggs, a slight girl with tangled brown hair, tucked beneath a green knitted beanie, her 2 long jeans brushing the tops of her boots. Alawan had turned 9 2 months ago. There hadn't been a party, just pancakes, a photo of her father placed on the table with a candle in front of it. She hadn't spoken since Delia glanced down at her. Stay in the front room. Okay, I'll be back. Alawan gave no answer, but nodded once. Then as her mother turned down the hall, she wandered quietly toward the observation wing. The front room was decorated with laminated posters of adoptable pets, handmade thank you notes from local school kids, and a bulletin board covered in lost pet flyers. A soft orange cat slept in a sunbeam by the window. His name was Cricket, a 13-year-old tabby with one ear and no tail, content to exist as the building's purring decoration. Cricket blinked slowly at Alawan and returned to sleep. Alawan's steps made no sound on the linoleum. She knew this building by heart, the way the lights buzzed in the office hallway, which kennels creaked when dogs moved, and where the floor tiles were uneven near the utility sink. But this morning, she didn't wander. She headed straight toward the back, toward the dog that no one would touch. The kennel hallway was dim, quiet. Alawan stopped at the edge just before the light changed. Down the row she saw the shape of him, bigger than the others, heavier. He was lying down, but his ears were up. Waiting Huckleby had not moved all morning. But when the girl appeared, something in his body adjusted. A tension subtle but sharp drew through his frame. His eyes tracked her slow and calculating. Alawan walked carefully until she stood just outside the steel gate. No closer. She lowered herself to the floor, without a sound crossed her legs and unzipped her jacket pocket. From inside she pulled a small broken cookie wrapped in tissue. She placed it beside the gate just beyond reach. Huckleby did not move, but he watched. Alawan didn't speak. She never did. Instead, she reached into her pocket again and pulled out a stubby blue crayon and a folded piece of paper. She leaned forward and began to draw. It was a simple picture, just the shape of a dog, lopsided and shaky with a heart floating above its head. She shaded the ears, then the tail, slow and focused. Behind her, someone cleared their throat. Marty Coulson, the shelter director, stood with a clipboard against her chest and one eyebrow raised. A stocky woman in her late 50s, Marty had the permanent look of someone who could lift a Rottweiler into a tub without breaking a sweat. She wore a forest green vest covered in pins, "Adopt, don't shop, dog mom," and one that simply read, "Coffee." "First, Alawan," she said gently, "you're not supposed to be in the kennel wing alone, sweetheart." Alawan didn't answer, but turned the paper toward the gate. Huckleby shifted, inching forward, nose close to the bars. He didn't growl. Marty blinked. "Well, I'll be a moment past." Then Huckleby laid down again, head on his paws. His eyes remained on the girl. Marty exhaled through her nose. "All right, just 5 more minutes." Then back to the lobby. "Okay." She left without another word. Alawan stayed until the end of the crayon. When she stood, she left the drawing by the gate and the cookie beside it. She looked once more at Huckleby, then walked away. By the time Delia returned to the front lobby, Alawan was seated by the window next to Cricket, both staring into the light. "You ready to go?" she asked, slipping her coat back on. Alawan nodded. As they left, neither of them saw the security camera monitor in the hallway. The footage would be reviewed later that afternoon by Marty. In the lower right corner of the screen, the image was clear, a drawing of a golden dog with a heart above its head, and a massive scarred golden retriever lying completely still beside it, eyes closed, like he was finally briefly at peace. The morning sun spilled across the pine-covered ridge of Winslow Hill like honey sliding down stone, softening the sharp cold that had lingered all night. A light frost had crusted the windows of the Evergreen Rescue Center, and steam curled upward from the rooftop vents. Inside, heaters clicked and hummed, the building slowly waking with its own kind of breath. Marty Coulson arrived before the others, as she often did. Her thick gray braids swung over one shoulder, and her clipboard was already tucked under her arm before the door even clicked shut. She was wearing her usual fleece vest, cargo pants, and rubber boots that clomped against the floor with purpose. She had 2 rituals before starting her day: feeding Cricket the one-eared tabby and checking the security footage from the night before. With coffee in one hand, she sank into the chair in the tiny surveillance room and pressed play on the monitor. Most screens showed little more than flickering shadows, restless paws, the occasional tail wag. But one screen held Her Kennel 16, Huckleby's cage. The camera angle caught the moment Alawan had placed the drawing outside the bars, followed by the small cookie. She never tried to retrieve. Marty leaned in closer, her brow furrowing as the footage showed something unexpected. At 2:43 a.m., Huckleby stood. No pacing, no growling. He walked to the edge of his cage, nudged the paper with his nose, then lay down his back to the wall, his massive head inches from the crayon, drawing, his eyes closed, and he didn't move again for hours. Marty swore under her breath, set the coffee down, and walked straight to the kennel wing. The hallway was quiet except for the occasional shuffle of paws from the other dogs. When she reached Kennel 16, she stopped. There it was. The drawing slightly smudged at the corners, still lying beside a clean food bowl, and Huckleby, curled like a great lion against the far wall, watching her, but not moving. Marty crouched low, careful not to meet his eyes directly. "Well, aren't you just full of surprises?" she murmured. "You like art, do you?" He didn't react. She stood, exhaled, and walked off, unaware that someone else had already noticed. Nash Tennyson, the kennel tech for the morning shift, arrived late and sleep-rumpled. 22 years old, curly red hair, and a tendency to misplace his keys. Nash was the kind of guy who always looked like he'd just woken from a nap. He wore tie-dye hoodies under his work apron, chewed on mint toothpicks, and talked to every animal like they were old poker buddies. As he made his rounds, he came to Kennel 16 and paused, then blinked. "Well, he said aloud. "Did you actually sleep last night, big guy?" He crouched and picked up the drawing, holding it up carefully, like it was evidence in a sacred case. "This yours?" Huckleby didn't growl. He didn't move either. Just watched Nash tuck the picture into the top pocket of his apron and continue down the row, but not without glancing back, more than once. By mid-morning, Dr. Delia Briggs was reviewing medication logs in the back office when Nash knocked once and entered. "I think you should see this," he said, holding out the folded crayon sketch. Delia took it and stared. Elowen, Nash nodded. "I think she gave it to Huckleby and he didn't destroy it. Didn't even move it, just sat there with it." Delia turned the paper slowly in her hands. The drawing was crude, but careful. A large golden dog, with dark circles around its eyes, standing on a green hill beneath a floating blue heart. "She hasn't drawn anything in months," Delia said quietly. "Not since Nash didn't need her to finish. He knew about the accident, everyone in town did. Do you want me to take the picture back to her?" Delia shook her head. "No, leave it with him. Let's see what happens." Elowen returned that afternoon after school. She entered without a word, her backpack half-zipped and dragging. She gave Cricket a soft pat on the head as she passed, then disappeared down the back corridor. Marty saw her go, but said nothing this time. Elowen didn't bring another cookie or another drawing. She just sat cross-legged in the same spot outside Kennel 16. The sketch was gone, but she didn't ask for it. Huckleby was lying near the bars, not curled or braced, just there. Not calm, not alert. Still. They stared at each other for a long time. The hallway remained quiet. Then something happened so small that no one else would have noticed. Elowen leaned forward and Huckleby's ears twitched, not flattened, not pinned, just curious. She whispered something. It was too soft to hear, and Huckleby, the dog who had fought gates and torn steel, blinked once, then twice. It was the first moment of silence that didn't feel like fear. Back in the office, Marty updated Huckleby's file. She paused at the behavioral observations section, then slowly typed, "Day 4, remained passive all morning, no signs of kennel aggression. Responded to visual object child's drawing and presence of quiet child without agitation. No growling, no lunging." She stared at the sentence for a moment, then added a second line. "Unclear why, but change has begun." Thatcher Briggs didn't like rules clocks or being told what to do, especially not by people who thought they understood him. At 15, he had already perfected the art of shutting doors too hard, letting silence answer questions and skipping school just long enough to make it sting. Since the accident that took his father, Thatcher had become a silhouette moving through the house, long-limbed, sharp-jawed, and carrying the weight of something too big for his age. He didn't speak much to his mother Delia anymore, not since the funeral, and certainly not to his younger sister Elowen, whose quiet sadness only seemed to make his louder. While she turned inward, Thatcher turned away toward friends with chipped skateboards, heavy boots, and pockets full of trouble. They smoked behind the gym, broke locks for fun, and bragged about how far they'd outrun the town deputy last summer. Thatcher didn't laugh much, but he stayed. They didn't ask him how he felt. They just let him be angry. When the school finally had enough of his truancy and the store owner caught him tagging the back of the feed shop, the town gave him a choice: face juvenile detention or do 30 hours of community service at Evergreen Rescue Center, where his mother worked. Thatcher chose the dogs. The first time he walked into the shelter, his black hoodie was up, headphones around his neck, jaw set like concrete. He didn't say hello, just signed the paper Marty Coulson gave him and shoved his hands in his pockets. He kept his shoulders high like armor. The work was boring. Hauling feed bags, spraying kennels, folding too many towels. The place smelled like metal and wet fur. Everything buzzed with artificial lighting and too much order. He hated it, but he didn't complain. He saw Huckleby on his second day. Marty didn't say much about the dog, just waved him past. Kennel 16 with a warning, "Don't linger." "He's meaner than he looks." Thatcher glanced sideways as he passed. Huckleby was lying still, his back turned. The fur around his neck was uneven, scorched and regrowing in patches. The muscles along his shoulders were tense even at rest. Thatcher paused a little too long, and Huckleby turned his head. Their eyes met. The dog didn't growl, didn't twitch, just stared, deep and level. A look that felt less like a threat and more like acknowledgement. Thatcher blinked, looked away, kept walking, but something about that look followed him all the way down the hall. The first snow hadn't fallen yet, but the wind over Winslow Hill carried the sharpness of the coming freeze. The trees whispered like they knew winter was close. At Evergreen Rescue Center, the kennels had been fitted with thicker bedding and plastic strips hung over exterior doors to keep warmth from bleeding out. Inside, the heaters buzzed low, trying to outmatch the chill. Eloan Briggs stood in the observation hallway, her mittens clutched tightly in both hands. Her coat, navy blue and slightly too big, hung past her knees, and her boots thudded softly as she rocked on her heels. It was the first time she'd been allowed beyond the gate. Next to her, Ruthie Maris, a senior handler in her mid-30s, with curly black hair tucked into a headband, and a no-nonsense energy crouched to Eloan's level. Ruthie had a round, warm face and always smelled faintly of eucalyptus. She had worked with dogs for 10 years, rescued 4 herself, and was known for her instinct. She could tell if a dog was going to lunge before it flinched. "You sure you're ready, Elle?" she asked gently, her hand on the latch. Eloan nodded once. "All right," Ruthie said. "Just 3 minutes. I'll be right here." The gate creaked as it opened, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Huckleby was lying in the far corner, his body low to the ground, head on his paws. His fur had started to thicken again, still uneven in patches, but cleaner brushed warm. When the gate clicked open, he didn't growl. His ears lifted slightly. Eloan stepped forward slowly. Her boots crunched faintly on the hay-covered floor. She didn't speak. She didn't reach. She just walked until she was 3 feet away, then sat down, cross-legged. Huckleby turned his head. For a long second, nothing moved. Then the massive dog, scarred and towering even at rest, tilted his head, then lowered it further until his chin touched the floor, eyes still locked on her. Eloan reached out her mitten-covered hand, trembling slightly. She hesitated, then removed the mitten and stretched her small hand forward, palm up. Huckleby sniffed once, then leaned forward. He didn't lick. He didn't flinch. He simply pressed his snout against her hand. Ruthie from the doorway whispered, "Holy hell." Eloan began to pet him slowly along his neck, down his back. Huckleby didn't move away. His body relaxed just enough to tell the difference. 3 minutes passed. Ruthie didn't call time. When Eloan finally stood, Huckleby lifted his head slightly as if reluctant to let the moment end. And when the girl walked backward toward the door, he followed just 2 steps, then sat down, watching her go. The next morning, Marty Coulson called a staff meeting in the break room. He let her touch him. She announced, dropping her clipboard on the table. Around the table sat Ruthie Delia and Nash Tennyson, whose face was halfway buried in a cinnamon muffin. "You serious?" Nash asked crumbs on his hoodie. She scratched behind his ears like he was a golden retriever, straight out of a holiday ad. Ruthie added, "Technically, he is a golden retriever," Delia muttered. Marty ignored them. "We're moving to the next test. Supervised lead walk." Everyone went quiet. With who? Ruthie asked. Marty flipped the page of her clipboard. Thatcher. When Thatcher Briggs arrived after school, he found Nash leaning against the kennel gate, smirking. "You've been drafted." Thatcher narrowed his eyes. "Drafted for what?" "Lead training. With your golden buddy." Thatcher looked past him, Huckleby was standing today, alert, pacing slowly. He seemed restless, but not aggressive. "No chance, Marty's orders," Nash replied, holding out a leash. "You walk him 10 minutes. I walk behind with a catch pole and mild anxiety." Thatcher took the leash with a grunt. "Fine, if I die, you're feeding my cat." "You don't have a cat. I'll get one, just so you'll suffer." The hallway was empty as Nash unlatched the kennel. Huckleby didn't bolt. He waited quiet. When Thatcher stepped in and clipped the leash to his collar, the big dog simply stood. For a moment, Thatcher froze. The weight of the leash in his hand felt heavier than it should have. "All right, buddy," he muttered. "Let's see if you know how to walk like you're not built to kill." They stepped into the main corridor. No lunging, no resistance. Huckleby walked beside Thatcher, shoulder to thigh, his paws, silent on the floor. Nash followed, holding the catch pole loosely at his side, but never used it. They walked one lap, then another. Huckleby didn't bark, he didn't strain. When Thatcher slowed, he slowed. When he turned, the dog mirrored the motion without needing pressure on the leash. They reached the end of the hallway and stopped. Huckleby sat. Thatcher blinked, breath caught in his throat. "Guess he thinks you're in charge now," Nash said quietly. Thatcher didn't respond, but he didn't let go of the leash either. He just stood there, and for the first time in weeks, maybe months, his posture relaxed. When Delia picked Thatcher up later that evening, she noticed something odd. He was still wearing. The leash looped around his wrist, even though the dog was long returned to his kennel. "You forgot to unclip," she said. He looked at the strap like it had appeared from nowhere. Then slowly he removed it and placed it on the console. "Not forgot," he said. "Just wasn't ready." By mid-afternoon, the clouds over Winslow Hill had thickened, muting the late autumn sun into a cold haze. The pine trees that skirted the edge of Alder Lake stood tall and still, their shadows long and unmoving. It was the kind of quiet that wrapped around your ears and made every snapped twig sound like thunder. Inside the Evergreen Rescue Center, the mood had been unusually light that day. Ruthie Maris was baking peanut butter treats for the dogs in the back kitchen, something she only did when she wasn't pressed for emergencies. Nash had been humming a tune from an old Bruce Springsteen album, bouncing slightly as he scrubbed kennels. Marty had even been heard chuckling under her breath while typing up a donor letter in the front office. And Thatcher Briggs, for the first time since his first shift, had offered to take Huckleby out for a second walk. "Don't get used to it," he muttered, clipping the leash to the big dog's collar. Huckleby had been calmer lately. Not passive, he still didn't like loud noises or sudden movements, but composed. His coat was filling out, and though his eyes were still wary, they no longer darted in panic. He walked beside Thatcher with a quiet focus, always glancing back once or twice as if checking the boy's pace. Across town. Delia Briggs stood in her kitchen, finishing a call with the school office. Her hand trembled slightly as she set down the phone. Elowen never showed up for pickup, the receptionist had said. "We thought maybe she walked straight to you," but she hadn't. Delia had driven the route twice. No sign Elowen wasn't home. Not at the school, not anywhere she should have been. She radioed Marty. The rescue center went into quiet chaos. Elowen Briggs had slipped into the woods sometime between the end of school and the time her mother began to worry. She had taken the long trail that edged behind the town library, a hidden footpath that wove between birch saplings and granite boulders. It was the way she always took when she wanted to be alone. She liked the quiet. The forest didn't ask her questions or wait for her to speak. The crunch of needles under her boots, the distant splash of birds at the lake's edge, it was the only place that didn't make her feel like she had to be someone else. But today she had gone farther than usual, and now the path had vanished beneath layers of pine and shadow. She stood frozen, heart racing. Her legs were scratched, her hands raw from catching herself on a fallen log. The cold was sharper now, pressing through her coat like fingers. She sat down beneath a leaning pine, wrapping her arms around her knees. She didn't cry. Not yet, but she didn't know the way back. Back at Evergreen, the staff scrambled. "She could have gone behind the lake," Marty said, pacing the office or toward the quarry trails. Ruthie added, "She hates the quarry." Delia said she wouldn't go that way. Thatcher had been silent until now, sitting on the bench outside Huckleby's kennel, his knuckles white around the leash. Then Huckleby let out a low, mournful sound. Not a growl, not a bark, a whine, deep and vibrating from his chest, like something primal had shifted. Thatcher looked down at him. Huckleby stood sudden and tense and pulled hard toward the door. The boy looked up. "He knows what?" Marty asked. He knows where she is? No way, Nash said. He hasn't been outside the center grounds. I'm not asking, Thatcher said, and unclipped the emergency latch on the gate. He didn't wait for permission. He slipped on a reflective vest, looped the leash tighter around his hand, and let Huckleby lead. The dog moved fast down the trail behind the shelter, across the shallow ditch near the old sawmill road, and into the low woods. Thatcher ran behind him, branches slapping his arms, shoes skidding on loose gravel. Huckleby didn't pause, didn't look back. His nose was down, ears sharp muscles like coiled wire beneath his coat. The boy didn't speak. He didn't even think. He just followed. The forest thickened the deeper they went. The sky was nearly gone above them, replaced by the reaching arms of fir and pine. Thatcher ducked under fallen limbs and pushed aside bramble thorns. He could barely keep pace, but then ahead, a stillness. Huckleby slowed. His breathing was louder now, visible in sharp white clouds. He moved through a thicket and came to a clearing, halting at the edge. Thatcher stumbled in behind him, and there she was. Ellawen curled beneath the lowest branches of a leaning pine, her legs tucked beneath her face, pale lips chapped. She looked up the moment they appeared, eyes wide with something that wasn't quite fear, but close. "Hey!" Thatcher breathed, chest heaving. "You scared the hell out of everyone." She didn't speak, she just looked at him, then at Huckleby. The big dog stepped forward slowly, nose twitching. He didn't bark, he didn't whine. He simply walked to her side and lowered himself onto the ground. Then gently he placed his heavy head across her lap, like he belonged there, like he'd always been, meant to find her. Ellawen exhaled shakily, then raised one trembling hand to rest on his head. Thatcher knelt beside them both. The pine trees didn't make a sound. The morning sky over Winslow Hill was the color of ash, pale, unmoving, and stretched too wide. A thin fog clung to the treetops, and the cold settled low, crawling across the ground in silence. Inside the Evergreen Rescue Center, the lights flickered to life one by one as Marty unlocked the front door. It was a slow day by all measures, but the phone had already rung twice before 9 a.m. The third call came just after Delia arrived, her coat still damp from the walk across the parking lot. She answered distractedly, expecting a supply delivery or another volunteer mix-up, but the voice on the other end didn't belong to any supplier. It was low roughened by age and smoke, and careful in its tone. The man introduced himself as Walter Fenwick, and he was calling about a dog. A golden retriever male. Around 6 years old, burn scars, chain collar, large frame. Quiet, Delia sat down slowly, her fingers tightened around the receiver. Walter explained that the dog's name originally had been Arrow. He'd been Walter's canine partner for 3 years during his final service as a rural fire investigator, a certified rescue dog trained for debris searches and rural fire recovery. Arrow had saved lives during wildland deployments across Oregon. A year ago, there had been a break-in. Walter had been away attending a funeral. When he returned, the back door was broken open. Arrow's crate had been pried apart. He filed police reports, posted flyers, waited, and then gave up. Until a few days ago, his niece, who lived in nearby Cresswell, sent him a link to a story in the local online paper. A dog that found a girl lost in the woods. A dog with golden fur and burnt ears. Arrow. Or at least it had to be. Delia asked if he wanted to come in. Walter said yes. He arrived the next morning in a dented forest green truck with rust along the bumper. He was tall but hunched slightly at the shoulders, dressed in an old canvas coat, worn jeans and work boots that had long since lost their shine. His hands were large and gnarled skin, like cracked leather, and he used a cane made of carved oak with initials burned into the side. Walter had a full gray beard and sharp blue eyes that looked like they had once seen through smoke. His voice was quiet, deliberate. A man who didn't speak unless he meant every word. Marty met him at the door, shook his hand firmly. Inside, Huckleby was lying in his kennel, calm but alert. Since the day in the woods, he'd changed. His energy wasn't submissive, but centered. He still didn't like sudden sounds or fast gestures, but his pacing had lessened, his eating steadied. The staff no longer walked past his kennel with caution. They walked with curiosity. When Walter reached Kennel 16, he didn't speak at first. He just stood at the edge, staring in. Huckleby stared back. No growl, no tail wag, just stillness. Walter reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He unrolled it carefully, revealing a dark brown leather collar. The brass nameplate was scratched but readable. Arrow. The old man held it against his chest for a moment, then lowered it to the floor just outside the kennel bars. "Do you remember me?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Huckleby shifted his weight, then stood. Everyone watching from Marty to Delia to Nash, who had snuck in with a donut halfway through, held their breath. Huckleby took 2 steps forward, then stopped. His eyes didn't soften, but they didn't harden either. He looked at the collar, sniffed once, then raised his gaze to Walter's face. Walter gave a tired smile. "You saved me once, pulled me from that collapsed trailer outside Bend. I'd trust you with my life again, but only if you trust me back." Still no movement. Then Huckleby turned, walked back to the far end of the kennel, and sat beside a laminated crayon, drawing Elowen's drawing, now pinned neatly to the wall, the one with the golden dog and the blue heart floating above its head. He curled up beside it, facing away from the man. In the staff room, Walter sat with a cup of black coffee and stared out the frosted window. "He didn't attack me," he said after a long silence. "But he didn't come to me either." "No," Delia said gently, "but I think he gave you his answer." Walter nodded. "He's got someone else now." He didn't cry, but there was a heaviness in the way he folded the collar back into the cloth, pressing it like something sacred. "I don't want to take him," he said. "That would be stealing him all over again." Delia sat beside him, her hand resting briefly on his. "You gave him everything. Once he's just giving someone else what you taught him to give." Walter chuckled softly. "Well, then I suppose I did something right." Later that evening, after the center had closed, Thatcher stopped by Kennel 16 during lockup. Huckleby was awake, his ears twitching at the sound of boots. Thatcher crouched. "You knew him," he said quietly. "But you stayed." Huckleby blinked. Thatcher reached into his back pocket and took out something small. A dog tag etched with a single word, Huckleby. He clipped it to the collar they'd been using since the beginning. It hung next to a fresh silver loop, smooth and unmarked. "Arrow's a good name," Thatcher said. "But you're Huckleby now." "Got it." The dog didn't reply, but he rested his head on his paws, right beneath the blue-hearted drawing. The morning of the decision came quietly. The air outside Evergreen Rescue Center was still heavy with early frost, the sun barely skimming the tops of the hills beyond the lake. The sky was pale gold, stretched and yawning, as if even the world held its breath. Inside, Kennel 16. Huckleby lay curled on his side, his body half shielding 2 familiar objects. A soft, well-worn plush rabbit with a stitched ear. The toy Elowen had placed through the bars nearly a month ago, and a laminated crayon drawing its corners, curling its ink slightly faded from breath and time. The golden dog with the floating blue heart watched over him from the wall. Just outside the kennel stood Walter Fenwick, still wearing the same canvas coat from 2 days before. The old firefighter's hands were steadier this time, but his cane tapped the floor just a little louder. He knelt slowly, laying the leather collar down just past the bars. "If you want to come home, Arrow," he said, his voice hushed and rough. "I'll wait as long as it takes." Huckleby stirred, opened one eye. He looked at the collar. Then slowly, without sound or hesitation, he reached forward, picked up the plush rabbit with his jaws, and carried it back to the far corner of his kennel. Then he lay down, back turned, eyes closed. Walter let out a long breath, nodded once, and wiped his cheek with a work-worn hand. "That's your answer?" That evening, Marty Coulson announced the news during the staff's end-of-week check-in. "We're finalizing the paperwork," she said. Flipping to the last page of the form, "Huckleby's going home." For good, Delia Briggs, sitting in the corner with a stack of notes in her lap, glanced at her children. Thatcher didn't smile, but his shoulders lowered slightly. Elowen, tucked beside him, gently clutched her drawing journal to her chest. Marty closed the folder and looked up. To the Briggs family, effective immediately. A moment of silence. Then Nash pumped his fist in the air. Finally, Ruthie chuckled, handing out mugs of tea. Better clear a spot under the dinner table. The adoption celebration happened quietly on a Thursday afternoon, just before sunset. The shelter held a small ceremony in the play yard, stringing up fairy lights between fence posts, arranging folding chairs and homemade decorations. The only guest of honor didn't wear a party hat. He sat proudly next to Elowen, fur brushed to a golden sheen, his rabbit toy between his paws. Huckleby didn't care for the attention, but he tolerated it, Mrs. Radley, a retired elementary school teacher with silver curls and oversized glasses, arrived with a tray of cupcakes and a framed photo she'd painted of Huckleby curled beneath a tree. She was well known in Winslow Hill for her watercolor portraits of animals, and she spoke to dogs in full sentences. "You chose them, didn't you?" she whispered as she crouched near him. "Smart boy." When Marty presented the official tag, a silver disc etched with Huckleby Briggs, Thatcher clipped it onto his collar himself. The dog didn't flinch. Later that evening, after the center emptied, the Briggs family drove home together for the first time, with Huckleby riding in the back seat. He didn't bark, just rested his chin on Elowen's lap while she hummed something quiet through the window glass. At home, Delia laid out a fresh bed beside the fireplace. But Huckleby followed Elowen upstairs. He lay beside her bed, circling once before, settling the rabbit toy pressed against his chest. He didn't move again until morning. The months that followed rewrote the rhythm of their lives. Thatcher quit spending time with the boys who smoked behind the mill and started volunteering at Evergreen twice a week on his own. Ruthie encouraged him to apply for a canine behavior training course in Eugene. He did, then passed the entrance interview, barely hiding his grin behind his hoodie as the acceptance letter arrived in April. Delia began journaling again, one entry each night, chronicling Huckleby's little victories, the first time he barked when the doorbell rang, but didn't hide, the way he let the neighbor's toddler pat his head during a walk, the night he chased his own tail for exactly 7 seconds before collapsing in what could only be described as dog laughter. And Elowen, she began speaking again, not all at once. But she read aloud to Huckleby every night stories about rivers, rescued dogs, mountains that talked. Sometimes she drew what she imagined he'd seen before. They met smoke forest stars above a burning hill. She always included the blue heart. It became their quiet language. A year later, Winslow Hill bloomed into its annual spring festival, held beneath the blossom-heavy trees, downtown. It was the first time in 10 years that Evergreen Rescue Center was invited to present an award. Marty took the mic, clearing her throat with more emotion than usual. "Today we honor a creature that reminded us trust isn't given, it's chosen, that love doesn't bark loud. Sometimes it just lays its head beside yours and waits." She gestured toward the main stage steps. Huckleby walked beside Elowen up the small ramp. Thatcher on her other side. The golden retriever sat composed as a young boy placed a tag over his collar. This one shaped like a heart, etched with the words, "Silent Hero of Winslow Hill." The crowd clapped, cameras flashed. Huckleby blinked, then turned his head and nudged Elowen's hand as if asking when they could go home. That night the town was quiet again. Blossoms floated in the dark like drifting stars. In her room, Elowen curled beneath her blanket, book in hand, voice low as she read to the sleeping dog at her feet. "You don't need medals," she whispered. "Just me," and Huckleby, already half dreaming, thumped his tail once against the floor. That was enough. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive in thunder or miracles that shake the earth. Sometimes it walks in on quiet paws, lies beside us without a sound, and reminds us that even what's been broken can choose to trust. Again, Huckleby didn't just find a home, he found purpose. He wasn't rescued by a shelter. He was chosen by love, guided by grace, and led by something greater. Maybe it wasn't just luck that brought him back to Elowen. Maybe it was something divine, a nudge from the heavens, a whisper from God saying, "You are not forgotten." And maybe that same whisper is meant for you. If you've ever felt lost, if you've ever felt like no one sees the hurt you're carrying, remember this story, because even in the silence, even in the shadows, God is still working. He brings the right souls together at the right moment. All we have to do is believe. If this story touched your heart, please share it. Leave a comment. Subscribe for more stories like this. And if you believe that God still moves through kindness, second chances, and the quiet bond between a child and her dog, type Amen in the comments. May God bless you, and may you always be found even when the world feels dark.